I'm going to open the floor to Dr. Jessica Wilson now. Jessica is the one I have not sat under all the way yet, but she's been a great point of contact for me already about some mutual interests, and we've had a really good Zoom conversation. So I'm looking forward to actually sitting under your teaching today, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. So, I would like to spend the next several minutes talking about reading, which of course is important to classical education and the classical education culture, but it's not really popular in practice. We are kind of leaning more and more in our culture towards easier ways of consuming information. And in fact, even to use that phrase is the only way to describe what we're actually doing, which is consuming information. And instead, the practice of reading is changing us in such a way that we approach other people and we approach the world differently. Instead of making us into consumers, the practice of reading is supposed to make us hospitable, humble, empathetic, and hopefully able to learn to love people as ends in themselves and not as means for our own ends. So I want to talk about reading and what that looks like, and especially in the classical world, which is often under fire for the kind of text that we teach. As Dr. Prather said this morning, a lot of people look at the things that we're teaching and say, why are you teaching all these dead white males? And so I want to talk about that as well this afternoon. And then my talk is not going to be that practical. It's going to be more about the motivation and the mode and kind of talking about the current culture and the ways that people understand what it is that we're doing when we're reading these dead white males and why it is that they find it a problem. And then I would hope to have some Q&A. So as questions come up, feel free to just put them in the chat as they come to you. And then we will get to spend some time hopefully answering those at the end of the session. So that's what I would like to do. So please do ask some of your practical questions or give your pushback in the chat box as we're going. It won't distract me. I'll just kind of walk through my talk and then we'll do that. So years ago, back when people were actually meeting in person, I was able to go to this author discussion at a bookstore in Austin, and it was by Jan Martel, who is the author of Life of Pi. And I don't really remember everything that he said, but I remember at the very end of the talk, he made a statement that has really stuck with me. He said that every year he sends his prime minister a novel. And I just found that fascinating. Of all the things you could do as part of your civic duty, why would you send your prime minister a novel? I can't even imagine anyone in America saying, like, I'm going to send the president a novel and that's going to be part of my civic duty. And yet he did. So there's an assumption there about the power of literature and what reading can do that Jan Martel was making in that statement that maybe we should share. The immediate refutation to that is going to be, okay, but reading literature is just not going to make people good. Right? No one assumes that Stalin would have been a better person if he would have just read more Shakespeare, right? And at the same time, Stalin understood something about the power of literature that made him ban Dostoevsky and censor Bulgakov and exile Solzhenitsyn from the Soviet Union. There is some mysterious power in literature that we cannot quantify that has an effect on the human person. And I think we need to understand that to understand what it is that we're fighting for as educators in the classroom and why we need to promote reading as much as we do. One of the books that I enjoy teaching is called An Experiment in Criticism. It's a book on how to read and why to read by C.S. Lewis that was written in the 1930s. And Lewis argues that in the same way that we escape into another person when we love them, right? That when you fall in love with your beloved, you want to sacrifice yourself for them. You want to give yourself over to them. So too in the act of reading something that we fall in love with. In the moral sphere, every act of justice, Lewis writes, or every act of charity will first involve putting ourselves into another person's place and thus transcending our own competitive particularity. Those are his words. So to move towards any kind of justice or charitable actions, we first need to understand and empathize with another person's way of seeing the world. In our current culture, all different forms of social media are actually training us to be autonomous centers of authority in the world. And yet the act of reading is taking us away from that, to see ourselves from another person's perspective, to see the world from another person's perspective. So to read a book is much like listening to another person. Lewis says when people ask questions such as, why should I read that book? It's a bit like asking, why should I listen to you? Because really that's what the reading experience is. We close our mouths for a few minutes and listen to what another person has to say. When the Black Lives Matter protest happened last summer, the first thing that you saw light up the New York Times bestseller list or light up the Amazon bookseller list was what? W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, because white readers wanted to understand Black rage. They understood that there was a gap in the knowledge that white people had in the world and their experience, and they wanted to understand another person's experience. They wanted to see with another person's eyes and be able to understand how they were seeing the world and how this was leading to the protest. The problem then on the other side has been acknowledging this gap in our reading experiences and trying to figure out how to overcome it. One of the things that has come out of this acknowledgement of the gap has been the DisruptTexts movement. I don't know if you're familiar with it. The founders of this movement aim, and this is their quote from their webpage, to create a more representative and equitable language arts curriculum, which I totally applaud. Next, they say they want to center and amplify minority perspectives to foster community. Again, still sounds good. Here comes the problem. In order to do this, they say it is not simply about replacing text written by dead white males. So if you say that something is not simply about that, that means that part of your goal is implied that it is about replacing text by dead white males, which we've seen and heard this morning should not be the goal, but it is about addressing racism, sexism, homophobia, and problematic issues. So how can we join this conversation so that we acknowledge the gap that is missing when we only read dead white males, but have more of an approach that's hospitable to invite people to the table rather than replace who's there with other voices? I want to move us more towards an idea that really is inclusive, which I think the DisruptTexts movement is trying to aim for inclusive. But by making the end inclusive, they've kind of lost the inclusion that they were aiming for. One of the reasons that this happens is they're making the wrong ends their goal. Their ends are relevancy, usefulness, and inclusivity. And the reason that they're doing this is that they want to prevent hate. Again, a noble goal. You cannot really prevent something as a goal, however. Instead, you must choose a good to be your aim. So let's look at relevancy, usefulness, and inclusivity for a second and see if we can find other ways of approaching text than those goals, especially for teachers choosing curriculum. Those should probably not be our ends, and I'll talk about why. First of all, relevancy. If we're going to choose books based on what's relevant to us, then we're making assumptions about our readers. We're making assumptions about our students. If you've read the poet Countee Cullen, who I love, who influenced Countee Cullen to become a poet? John Keats. No teacher teaching Countee Cullen, who is a 1930s Black poet, would have said, in order to be relevant to Countee Cullen, I'm going to teach John Keats. But what you have to do is you have to assume first that the humanity is the most triumphant characteristic of a person, and not choose what is relevant necessarily to that person, and thus condescend your assumptions about what's relevant, but rather acknowledge the broadness of Countee Cullen's humanity and teach the best that has been thought and said. In the same way that if you looked at Simone Weil, you wouldn't necessarily say, what am I going to teach this French mathematician in the 1940s to be relevant to her? Because what was relevant to her was the Iliad. It's what inspired her to join the active movement against the resistance against the Nazis, to read the Iliad. You can't control what is going to be relevant to another person. But if you are making a decision that based on what's best, the best that has been thought and said, then you're going to be able to expand a person's humanity, for them to join the conversation, to enliven them, to ennoble them. And in this way, we're not going to fall for the fallacy of presentism, in which we assume only what is currently interesting to us or relevant to us is what we must read. Instead of changing your relevancy every single year, you're going to be preserving something for the future from the past and be joining something that is much larger than what's relevant just to your current student body. Secondly, I would say against usefulness, the very act of reading should not be a useful act. So I'm going to say that maybe 20 times in different ways, because I think the idol of use is one of the biggest problems in today's education. We are only choosing things that we deem useful. And therefore, the very act of reading itself, we are oftentimes standing over the text and judging it and pulling from it what we want to find useful for us. We're making the text a means for something for our own agenda. In the same way that we would never want to treat a person like that. We would never want to walk up to Susie and say, how can she be useful to me? When I'm listening to her talk, what do I want to hear? What is going to help me? What am I going to gain from this conversation? That kind of approach to human beings is problematic. It's what got us into a lot of problems in our histories, to treat people like objects that can be used for our own purposes. Instead, the act of reading should be something where we're practicing understanding. I'm just going to grab the first book on my thing real quick. Hopefully not lose my place. But to stand under a text and let it read you is a very different disposition than to stand over. One of them is humble. What do I have to learn from this process? What can this person teach me as I place myself at their feet and beneath them as a teacher? Right? In every conversation, we would want to do the same thing. We want to teach our students to have a disposition towards people in which you are open to learning from them. You're open to receiving the gift of their humanity. And that's the disposition we want to have when we're reading. So to treat text as though they are useful, or to choose which books to read based on their usefulness, is diametrically opposed to the very act of reading and what it can do for a person. Finally, inclusivity. Of course, this is a buzzword. There are lots of goods to inclusivity. Here's the problem when it becomes an end in and of itself. To be inclusive as an end is impossible, because you cannot include everything ever. It just is impossible. G.K. Chesterton's a writer that I like from the early 1900s, and he says, watch what happens when I include everything. I'm holding on to nothing. So to conclude absolutely everything, you end up holding on to nothing. So you will end up making choices. You will determine what to exclude and what to include. So it can't be your goal just to be inclusive. You have to have a higher end or a higher goal about what to include and why. So when the DisruptTexts movement, for example, is saying that their higher goal is inclusivity and they want to choose what's better, what's their criteria for better? If it's only inclusivity, then you're talking in a circle. Instead, we want to look at the best that's been thought and said. What is timeless? What has been beautiful? What challenges us? Now, C.S. Lewis, I think, is a really good, helpful point here for what is better and what is worthy. We do not necessarily just look back at the canon itself and see that it has nothing wrong with it, that it is a product that we're passing down. That's not what it is. A canon is a living thing. The only texts that matter are the ones that we continue to live as though they matter. We have to actually embody them and carry them forward, or else they're not worthwhile for us. So when we look back, we want to look, and instead of substituting what is relevant or useful from the past, we need to have a conversation. We need to see ourselves as going back in time and sitting at the table of these texts. So when we sit at Homer's table, what do we learn? Are we learning things that we can continue to live? And if we are learning things that we can continue to live, then perhaps we should continue reading those texts. Moreover, if we see others around us being changed and transformed by this process of reading that text. I mean, this is kind of what Dr. Parham was saying this morning. She saw what other students were doing. She saw what other people were learning and how it was actually bearing good fruit. It was becoming fruitful in their lives. They were living differently from that text. Most of the literature that we find that is useful or relevant or only inclusive, perhaps that, YA novels that we find that might speak, so to speak, we use that language of speaking to our students. I don't know how much transformation you have from reading a book that's exactly like you. When you read a text that sees the world exactly like you do, you don't change. When you read a book that does not speak to you, but challenges you, makes you sit at its table, makes you change your assumptions, makes you dialogue with it and decide whether you think what it's presenting is true or good or beautiful, suddenly some sort of transformation is happening in you. Now, Lewis writes, one of the chief aims of operations of art is to remove our gaze from the mirrored face, because that is a solitude, that we may enter the opinions, attitudes, feelings, and experience of others, and thus not remain in an insulated world in which, the kind of the tunnel vision we currently experience sometimes, where every advertisement is made to suit our needs. Every book that it recommends to us by Amazon is made to suit our needs. And instead, we're breaking out of that and realizing that we have greater eyes than that. We can see with myriad eyes upon the world, and we are not limited to our tunnel vision. How do we know then what is worth reading and what is good? Lewis says that when we read a text and it demands our attention, when it makes us into good readers, is one of the first indicators that it's a good book. And what he means by this is kind of like the experience when you go to a movie. If you find yourself constantly saying, oh, why did they make that scene choice? Why is that camera angle like that? Who chose that actor for that part? That doesn't make any sense. You're not in the experience of the film, right? You're judging it and analyzing it. It has not made you into a good viewer of a film. When you get lost in the magic of the movie and you forgot you were watching it, right? You have those moments where you're like, as though something really bad's going to happen, but nothing really bad's going to happen because it's in a movie. That kind of experience is what you should have in a good book. You can't look away. You can't stop reading. The hour passed. You read every word instead of skipping around for what you're wanting. It's actually changing you into a good reader is a sign that it's a good text. And this is one of those important indicators for Lewis that if we go into a book not ready for that experience, we'll never find it. So it's important too, the kind of disposition we take upon the text. For example, if you go to meet a person and you expect that they have nothing to talk to you about, they probably will have nothing to talk to you about. In the same way that if you read a book and you expect that it has nothing to give you, you're probably going to find nothing there. So we have to have a certain disposition of openness. And then if we find the practice of reading is making us into good readers, and then that practice is transforming us and challenging us, and then it's bearing fruit that other people can see, those are the moments we know we found a good book. And those are the moments that we're looking for. Lewis says we find a bad book only by reading it as if it might, after all, be very good. We empty our minds and lay ourselves open. The person who opens herself to a good book, to assume that the book itself might have the line that divides good and evil running even between the pages, might actually learn something about herself. To presume that our eyes, on the other hand, are the only eyes that matter will lead us to inhabit a very tiny world. Lewis likens this to a prison. And yet I love this quote, how he ends his book. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 people and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, and yet it is still I who see. In the same way that we talked about this morning, that none of us is the author of our own tale, so we cannot pretend that we are the only character in the story that matters. We want to open ourselves up to a larger story by seeing all the people who've gone before and joining them and passing on to the next generation so that they can continue to write their stories.